Good evening, Trapped in History followers. Welcome to episode 68. This is Wrestling with Nationalism. I am your host, Robbie Malcolmson, and you are trapped in history. Tonight, we are going to wrestle not just with events, but with ideas and identities. We're going to grapple with a significant topic in world history, and that is going to be nationalism, a force that has united and divided, liberated and oppressed, and inspired and destroyed civilizations. This episode will take us from the French Revolution through the rise of totalitarianism, the devastation of two world wars, the Holocaust, and into the struggles of decolonization that reshapes the 20th century at the conclusion of Unit 9 in AP European history. Now, as a history teacher, and specifically an AP European history teacher, I want you to think not only about chronology, but also about the philosophical and moral dilemmas that these events present. Tonight, we are going to examine nationalism not just as a political ideology, but as a human force that can inspire courage, creativity, and freedom, or possibly fuel oppression, violence, and war. Our wrestling match tonight with nationalism begins way back in Unit 5 in 1789 at the onset of the French Revolution. This is a moment that fundamentally redefined Europe. Before this upheaval, monarchs used to rule by divine right, especially these absolute monarchs that we had covered previously in Unit 3 and in other units. And society was structured by this traditional feudal-like state system. And the majority of people, the peasants and the commoners, were subjects with very limited rights. Political authority wasn't inherited. It was hierarchical and it was extremely rigid. Then came this revolutionary idea, this revolutionary challenge of popular sovereignty. The Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen in 1789 proclaimed that political legitimacy resided not in kings, but in the consent of the governed, in the consent of the people. Citizenship became a duty as much as a right, and nationalism defined as loyalty to a political community based on shared identity, culture, and history. And it became a force to mobilize the masses. Now imagine this in 1792, Paris, the citizens are waving the famous tricolor flag, and they're answering the call of levy en masse, the mass conscription that takes place that transforms society into this new mobilized army defending the revolutionary nation of France. Now, nationalism at this point, it was liberal, revolutionary, it was anti-aristocratic. It directly challenged the old hierarchies of privilege, and we saw writers this year like Edmund Burke and Metternich, these other conservative writers that pushed back on this liberal, extremely radical type of change. Yet, after the French Revolution, the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, it added more complexity to what we have to wrestle with. Napoleon, he spread revolutionary reforms across the entire continent of Europe. The Napoleonic Code, or the Napoleonic Civil Code, centralized or caused the centralization of administration, the abolition of the feudal privileges of that estate system from before, and promotion of legal equality, under the law. But he also had several things that he restricted as well. There were certain moves that Napoleon was doing that was unethical, like placing relatives on foreign thrones and controlling conquered territories. In Spain, Italy, and the German states, nationalist resistance arose, not in support of the revolutionary ideals, but as anti-French nationalism, defending local autonomy and identity. And we would see this eventually extend into the Congress of Vienna, the Concert of Europe, eventually all the way into the unification of not only Italy, but Germany as well. Now here we see what we would call our first philosophical tension. And we have to ask ourselves the question, can an ideology born to liberty be used to dominate? Can the rhetoric of freedom justify imperial conquest? And this is what we would see used sometimes, that radical revolutionary vocabulary used to not only be able to defend these ideas of natural rights and consent of the governed, but also be able to be misused by authority members in order to gain more power, to restrict the freedoms of other people. So you can kind of see the hypocrisy that's involved here. And I think this is a great chance to take a turn and look at the decline of Napoleon and into the Congress of Vienna and the Concert of Europe as we wrapped up Unit 5 in the school year, going into Unit 6 and 7 after Christmas time, when most teachers are able to kill Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, Napoleon's defeat brought like I said earlier, the Congress of Vienna, which was a 2-year sort of meeting between 1814 to 1815. Remember, 1815 being a very important date to remember in AP European history. And in this event, this meeting, there were statesmen like Clemens von Metternich who sought to restore the old order, this conservative ideology of people like from England, Edmund Burke. They wanted to reinstate the traditional monarchies, suppress nationalism and liberal revolutions in general, and maintain a balance of power in Europe. But in doing so, they ignored the realities of ethnic, linguistic, like speech and cultural identities, leaving millions under foreign and imperial rule. This is obviously going to create some tension that will last for many, many decades later, maybe even centuries later. The Concert of Europe, it will enforce this conservative order. Austria, Prussia, Russia, Britain, and France coordinated diplomacy and interventions to suppress uprisings in Italy, Spain, and elsewhere throughout Europe. But nationalism, our topic tonight, like water beneath the ice, could not be fully contained. It resurfaced in the 1820s, in the 1830s, with an event called the Greek Independence from 1821 to 1830, which challenged Ottoman rule, blending romantic cultural nationalism with these other liberal ideals. Poland will have staged uprisings against Russia, emphasizing their own sovereignty and their own right to constitutional governance. And we're going to see a backlash back at this again later before we get into World War II with Stalin's intervention into Poland along with Adolf Hitler. Now, the lesson that we can wrestle with tonight with nationalism is that nationalism is resilient and adaptable, capable of both cultural affirmation and political rebellion. Philosophically, it raises the question, when is loyalty to one's nation morally justified? When does it justify rebellion against authority? Because especially when you're looking at the majority of Europeans being from a Christian point of view or even a Jewish point of view, you're looking at like an Old Testament version of God, a God that commands a level of obedience being very honorable. So if you look at your leaders still tied into religious, I guess you can say philosophy, that could also still make that difficult to go, okay, when am I being patriotic? When am I being nationalistic? When am I being loyal to my faith, my family, my community? And when do we know when it's time to rebel against that authority, if that authority is oppressing rights or anything like that? And that leads to another significant event there in the middle of the 1800s, the middle of the 19th century. We refer to it as the revolutions of 1848. The revolutions were the largest wave of nationalist uprisings in the 19th century. Across France, the German states, Italy, and the Austrian Empire, people demanded political reform, social justice, and national self-determination, the right to determine for themselves how they should be ruled. Again, this is extension greatly from the era of the Enlightenment in Unit 4 and these ideas and how much they have spread across European history. And I think that the French Revolution just really thrusted all that forward, and maybe it was even more exacerbated by the correct use and misuse that Napoleon Bonaparte might have done in the past. Now, in the German states, liberals during the revolutions of 1848 debated unification under a constitutional framework. Italy saw uprisings against Austrian domination, inspired by Giuseppe Mazzini's Young Italy movement. Most revolutions did fail. As we teach our students, most revolutions of the 1848 failed. It doesn't mean that there was not good that came out of this. conservative armies do regain control, but the revolutions revealed the strength of nationalist sentiment. And that begins to become more global, not just a European ideology. Now, nationalism, it had shifted from now an ideology to a tangible political force demanding change. The philosophical tension that we can wrestle with here and that emerges again is what happens when ideals confront entrenched power, especially over many centuries. Is moral authority sufficient to overthrow political authority? Again, this is where you get into the military clashes and the violence that can be often tied into nationalist revolutions that take place. Because these governments that are entrenched are not just going to willfully step down in most circumstances. So there's going to be some type of a clash there. So then we have to wonder philosophically, what is a just or what is an unjust form of rebellion or clashing, depending on the context of where someone is at or what time period is going on, maybe what collateral damage could be caused from that. These are things that many Europeans had to wrestle with, and we should wrestle with as we discuss these topics, as we teach them, as we learn them as students. I'd like to also hit on something that we can spiral back to from like state building in Unit 3, but I like to really use nationalism as a platform to really get into what we refer to in that modern era as state building or nation state building. Now, the mid to late 19th century, the 1800s there, it shows that nationalism is now a practical tool for unification and power. In Italy, for example, first, they combined diplomacy, rebellion, and military campaigns. You had leaders like Cavour, Garibaldi, Victor Emmanuel II, and Mazzini. They unified the peninsula of Italy in 1861, where nationalism it was here to fuse the elite planning with the popular support of the people. And again, you don't then have the Italian separate states anymore, but this unified Italy that now might be able to do better at maintaining its strength or growing its strength into the next century, as other nation states have already unified or have already been going around the world doing a second wave of colonization, all these other things that would have put more pressure on the German states, on the Italian city-states to also unify. It was not just only about the aftermath of Napoleon Bonaparte, the Congress of Vienna, and the Concert of Europe. Now, the other main place that involved unification for our class is in Germany. Famously, the name Otto von Bismarck, he used Realpolitik, or Politik, to better pronounce that, emphasizing pragmatic methods over ideology to blend together sort of a ruthless way of doing politics with also military uses in order to centralize more power onto him and onto the Prussian state and onto bringing Germans together and unifying them, especially by the conclusion of the Franco-Prussian War. Now, through the wars that Otto von Bismarck fights, like with Denmark in 1864, Austria in 1866, and France, ultimately in the Franco-Prussian War from 1870 to 71, he unifies the German states under this Prussian leadership. The German Empire was now officially proclaimed at the Versailles in the palace in 1871. This is going to humiliate France and establish Germany as a European power, and that animosity will continue all the way into 1914 when we see the beginning of World War I. And again, within unification, nationalism now intertwined with other topics such as militarism, like the rise and the building up of military, getting it ready for war. Industrialization, we cannot forget that that's a significant quality going through the latter half of the 1700s into the 1800s, into the 1900s. You also have imperial ambition, not just with the scramble for Africa, but with other places around the world. There is a lot of pressure to the European states to one-up each other, so to speak, as it gets closer and closer to World War I. There is then groundwork that nationalism can be used to inspire the secret alliances that we see Bismarck and others do that leads to World War I. The rivalries, the other conflicts that culminate in that First World War. Now, the nationalist fervor that we see, it's coupled with the ethnic tensions of the Eastern Europe. So if we go down to Southeastern Europe in what's called the Balkans, nationalist fervor will trigger the assassination famously of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914, resulting in the conflict of mobilizing millions of people, destroys empires, and reshapes the map of Europe entirely. The post-war Treaty of Versailles, it punishes Germany with reparations, territorial losses, and humiliation, creating a fertile ground for radical extremism, especially in nationalism. And this is going to cause nationalism to sort of mutate again from a liberation idea to grievance, from identity to ideology again. Philosophically, we must ask ourselves, how do we unresolve grievances and collective humiliation? How can they affect political morality? How does identity become a weapon? And we're going to see that as we go into the rise of totalitarian leaders, of fascism, communism, and into World War II. In Italy, Mussolini fused together this ultra-nationalism, authoritarianism, and militarism in what we know as this fascism, like the glorification of the state, the glorification of war, led by a totalitarian, authoritarian leader, a dictator in Mussolini. In the Soviet Union, Stalin will consolidate more power after Lenin, creating a totalitarian state that controlled ideology, society, and the economy. In Germany, Adolf Hitler rose with a blend of nationalism, racial ideology, and anti-Semitism, promising pride, territory, and revenge. In World War II and the Holocaust, they show in Unit 8 that nationalism at its most destructive point. And I always tell students that the Nazis are one of your greatest examples of extreme nationalism gone wrong. 6 million Jews and millions of others were systematically murdered. Yet even in this darkness, nationalism, it will inspire or did inspire resistance like partisan fighters, like in France and other territories, underground networks, and international alliances. Just because you have one extreme version of nationalism doesn't necessarily mean it trumps all the other forms of nationalism that may rise to then put out that other radical, more negative form. And here we have to wrestle with another moral, ethical question. How can loyalty to the nation justify oppression or a genocide, especially in desperate times? In Unit 9, we get to one of our last topics as far as content-wise for the school year to wrestle with for nationalism. After 1945, after World War II and the devastation, Europe lay in ruins. But the global balance was already shifting. Weak European powers enabled nationalist movements to rise and spread across the continents of Asia and Africa and other places, namely, for our class, in places like India with Gandhi, the Indian National Congress. It's going to achieve its independence in 1947 through a partition of India, which also created Pakistan, and it's going to spark violence there. You can also tie in the origin of that rivalry between Pakistan and India within there. You also have Vietnam. It's a great setup for the proxy wars, the hot wars that are to come in the Cold War later on with Ho Chi Minh. He's going to resist, or did resist, French colonial rule, leading to a prolonged conflict with them, eventually even against that struggle against the United States in the Vietnam War throughout the 60s and into the 70s. And then in Africa, in like places like Ghana, Algeria, and other movements will blend nationalism together to be able to try to kick out a lot of these imperial powers in this anti-imperialist sort of movement. And here again, nationalism becomes this force of liberation. It's almost like a full circle again here in places like India, Vietnam, Africa, other places. It's the idea of liberation, like the way we saw almost like in the Haitian Revolution. But also it highlights the tension between unity and division, identity and ideology, and freedom and sacrifice in terms of philosophical principles. Now, to wrap this podcast up as far as my narrative with you here, as an AP European history students and teachers, we have to recognize that nationalism is neither inherently good or bad. It has unified and divided people, liberated and oppressed people, inspired courage and justified atrocities. It is a lens through which we can understand revolutions and unification, world wars, totalitarian regimes, the Holocaust, and into decolonization. Again, we need to use it like a tool as a way to also add complexity and nuance to understand these events in a deeper way. Nationalism as an idea challenges us to ask questions like, what does it mean to belong? How far should collective identity dictate action? When does loyalty become a moral danger? From 1789, where we started at with the French Revolution, into the 1970s in Vietnam, in Africa, and in India, these are questions we must wrestle with. History is not just a story of events, it is a story of human choices, moral and ethical dilemmas, and the tension between power, identity, and principle. And tonight we wrestled with those ideas, and I hope that you continue to wrestle with them on your own, whether as a student or as a teacher. And again, we need to recognize that the struggle over nationalism and what it means to belong continues to shape our world today, especially as Americans. And as usual, I want to finish this episode with 3 philosophical questions to continue your discussion amongst your other teachers or your class or any kind of groups you might be in. The first question we can look at tonight is nationalism a force for liberation or for conflict? And obviously throughout this episode, we can see that this is a dichotomy of both of these things. We can also look at this question in a more complex way. If you want to break it down and give your class a more challenging look at this, or for you as the teacher to challenge yourself more, you could ask the question, if nationalism can both liberate people and drive nations toward violence, is the ideology itself inherently dangerous, or does the danger come from how leaders and societies choose to use it? And that might be a more specific, better way of asking that. You could tie that into the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror, Napoleon Bonaparte and his empires, the unification of Germany and Italy, all the way into World War I and II, into the justification for atrocities, and even into decolonization. The second question tonight will be, should cultural identity determine political borders? A more complex and detailed version of this question, depending on how you feel, if your class is ready for this kind of thing, or if you as a teacher are ready for this. Is it possible or even desirable to organize political states around cultural or ethnic identity? Think about what problems arise when different groups claim the same land. And this is a great way to look at Israel and Palestine and other places. And students, again, they can reflect on the Austro-Hungary issues with the Ottomans, the Balkan areas in the past. Lots of those, Vietnam, those are other regions to think about. Our last question of the night to finish up episode 68 is, does national unity require power and conflict? A more complex, wordy way of asking this is, do major political transformations, such as the creation of new nation states, inevitably require force and conflict, or could nationalism have developed peacefully? Again, thinking of Bismarck's wars in the past, political ideas and which ones have survived and which ones have faded away over time. The idea of liberal nationalism and conflict with the conservative ideas, depending on where you're at. Again, this is a really interesting topic that we could revisit again later on. And we're going to bring up nationalism in many podcast episodes in the future. This was meant to be more of a survey, sort of a deep dive look at what role did nationalism play throughout this school year that may help AP European History teachers and students best understand the topic. As usual, I hope that all of you had a great night, and I really appreciate you for joining me. I'm sorry that it's been over a month again since my last episode. I'm going to be trying to post a lot of episodes here, trying to hit on topics like this one in Unit 7 into Unit 8 and Unit 9, and at least get your content episodes for this year done as far as a macro look at Unit 7, 8, and 9 as we're going forward. And then I'll get back into doing some interviews with people again. But other than that, as always, continue to keep asking questions in order to better understand the past. And as always, be contagious.